Hello and welcome to this next session in Study the Book of Ephesians. And this is our third session, particularly in the three things that Paul wants us to focus on and to pray. And he's asking that the eyes of our hearts will be enlightened. And so 2 sessions ago, we looked at this hope to which we were called last time, to the riches of his glorious inheritance in the saints. And this session will kind of draw the links between them. We won't focus on as much detail yet on his incomparable great power for us who believes, because in the next sessions, Paul unpacks what this power is, that the power is like the working of his mighty strength. So he doesn't unpack this calling. He doesn't unpack the inheritance of the saints, but the third one he unpacks. And so we're going to touch that over, several sessions. But I want to draw the links between the three in this session. So hopefully that makes sense. So there's a few things that we need to look at. So he's asked that we be enlightened, okay, that our eyes be illuminated, that we no longer be in darkness, but we see light. And he wants us to see this hope. He wants us to see the riches, the glorious inheritance, and he wants us to see this great power. But there's a few things that he does to draw, and it's interesting to see how he prays this. And again, our English translations don't allow us to see this. So, in order that you may know the hope to which you have been called. Okay, so the eyes of our heart may be enlightened, in order that you may know what is the hope. So it's in there in the Greek, what the hope to which he has been called. What the riches of the glorious grace of the saints, and what his incomparable great power for us who believe. And so that's there in the Greek, which is very interesting, because what effect does that have? Because he could easily have written it as, at least my English translation does, in order that you may know the hope of which you're called, the riches of his glorious grace, and his incomparable great power. That would be, he could have written that in the Greek, but he doesn't. He writes what the hope to which you have been called, what the riches of the glorious grace, and what is an incomparable great power. And so what effect does this have to his readers? And I think it's this. He's not just praying to God, he's obviously writing this prayer to the saints. And so, to this end, I think it's to make them stop and be awakened to these truths. Think what it is to have hope of a calling. Think what it is to have a glorious inheritance. Think what it is to have immeasurably great power. Think what that is. He wants us to stop and think what this is, which is why he wants us to have our eyes enlightened, the eyes of our heart enlightened. He wants us to value. Remember, this word here for the heart is, as opposed to the mind, the heart knows value. It knows beauty. It knows treasure or worth. It knows these things. He wants us to know these things and to make us stop and to think about what this is. And so he purposely adds the what. And so he's praying it to the Lord. But for those who are listening to this prayer, it's almost as if he wants them to stop and think, what is this hope? What is this calling? What is this inheritance? What is this great power? Why does he want us to know this? Why does he want our eyes to be opened and our eyes of our heart to be enlightened? Well, if I understand the hope of his calling, the riches of his glorious inheritance, his incomparably great power, how does that make me know him better? Why does me knowing these things down here, why does that make me know him better? I think that's just one aspect that just sets everything up in what we're about to uncover. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this hope isn't qualified. There's no qualification before this hope, as opposed to we've got glorious inheritance. That's what he wants us to know. Great power. That's what he wants us to know. But he's qualified it by saying riches of his glorious inheritance in the saints and his incomparably great power. But he doesn't have anything before this hope. Why is that? Well, I'd like to suggest that hope is a general summary. So the hope is a general summary, and then it's split almost into two things. One, the content to this hope, which equals his inheritance. And two, the certainty of it through his power. So there's a general hope to which we have been called, and we've been called to the riches of his glorious inheritance. It's a content. The content of this hope is the glorious inheritance. And how do we obtain this? How do we make sure that we get this? Well, it's through his great power. It's through his great power that makes it certain. So this hope has a context, and this hope has a certainty of power attached to it. It's riches of glorious inheritance and immeasurably greatness of his power. And so that's why I think there's no qualifier of this hope, as opposed to the riches of his inheritance, his incomparably great power. It takes the hope is filled, or the content of this hope is filled with the riches of the glorious inheritance, and it's brought certainty by his incomparably great power that makes it certain. It secures it for all to see. And so if we stem through what we're looking at here, I've got this, do this over here. So verses 3 to 14 is great doctrine and theology. Okay, that's what we've covered 3 through 14. Verses 15 to 16, we see that the Ephesians have accepted it. They've accepted this great doctrine, this theology, and that's seen through their faith and love for one another. And now in 17 to 19, in order to understand the truth, the depth of 3 to 14, he prays. And he prays, one, that we have the spirit of wisdom and revelation. We need to have a spirit of wisdom and revelation to understand this. He prays that we know him better. He prays that the eyes of the heart be enlightened. And 4, enlightened to the hope, the glory, and the power of God. And that's the balance of what we've seen so far through Ephesians 1. It's what we've got, this great doctrine of theology through 3 to 14 about what God has done for us, what he has done, what he's predestined, what he's chosen to do, what he's done for the praise of his glorious grace. And Paul's identified that in the Ephesians through their faith and their love for one another. He's heard of their faith, he's heard of their love, and they've accepted it. And because they've accepted it, he's now praying. Remember, this is the prayer, and this is how we should pray every time we read Scripture. Pray for a spirit of wisdom and revelation. Pray that we will know God better through it. Pray that the eyes of our heart will be enlightened and that we will ponder and see clearly, in this case, the hope, the glory, and the power of God is ultimately to the praise of his glorious grace. So that's a good summary of what we've looked at so far. And it's just seen here again. And next time round, we will focus on this great power. There's so much that comes from this great power. And it comes right through in other sections that we'll look at. But for now, this is where we leave this section, that he's prayed for a spirit of wisdom, of revelation, pointing back to 3 to 14. That we may know him better. That's the reason why we need to understand this. If we understand this, we'll know him better. And I pray that the eyes of your heart be enlightened, that you may know the hope to which he called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in the saints. That's important. And his incomparably great power to believe. He's given us a hope. He's given us a summary, a calling. And this calling is to an inheritance. And this which is the content. It's rich, it's nutritious, it's wonderful, it's glorious, and it's secured through his great power. And this power is like the working of his mighty strength. And so may you rest in this truth, and may we learn to pray like Paul in these things. Seek and pray for revelation, to know God better, that your eyes of your heart that values things be enlightened, and that we value the truth. This is the truth part here that Paul's praying here. And so whatever scriptures you are reading, pray for these three, but then name them. See what the truth is and pray for them and ask God to enlighten your eyes of your heart so that you can value them and treasure them. Treasure the hope, treasure the glory, treasure the power of God.